I'll always remember that Christmas when the storm blew in. This was back in 82 or 83, and my family was living in a little house in North Georgia. Dad worked as a logger, Mom stayed at home to take care of me and my brother, and Grandpa had lived with us ever since Grandma died the year before. My uncle and aunt had come to stay with us for the holidays, and my two cousins, Ella and Jasper, were sharing the loft in the attic with me and my brother. Our little 3-bedroom cabin seemed pretty cramped, but we all just thought it would be until after the holidays. That was until the blizzard rolled in. It was December 20th, 4 days before Christmas, and we were all playing outside. The adults had said we were getting a little too loud and had asked us to go out for a bit, so we put on our coats and mittens and went out to play. My brother wanted to play hide and seek, and my cousins and I, all of us about 4 to 6 years older than him, had agreed begrudgingly. We were too old for baby games, my youngest cousin a whole year older than me, but we agreed, mostly so we'd have something to do. So Jasper and I were hiding under the porch, talking about something to do with hunting, I think, when I blinked as something drifted past my face. Jasper quieted as he noticed it, and I reached out my hand and caught a delicate-looking snowflake. I'd seen snow before. You don't live in North Georgia for long without seeing some snow, but this was the first snow I thought might actually stick. It had been unseasonably warm for North Georgia, most days sitting around 45, and we had been worried that our white Christmas might be a bust. As the snow began to fall harder, really coming down, we abandoned our game of hide and seek and devolved into little kids at the sight of all that powder. It was really amazing how quickly it came down, half a foot seeming to appear in minutes, and we began making snowmen, having snowball fights, and looking for the sleds in the tool shed so we could go to the holler and glide down on the fresh powder. Our parents came out on the porch, looking in awe at all that snow, and when Dad tapped his little thermometer that hung next to the rain gauge, I realized that it was pushing 50 degrees. I didn't think about it at the time, but there was no way that all that snow could be sticking. It was above freezing, and the snow should have been turning into slush before it hit the ground. To us, it seemed like a Christmas miracle, but as the sun went down and the adults went inside, I noticed Grandpa come out, and he looked at the sky with distrust. I watched as he walked out to the wood pile and took a piece of stove wood back with him, my distraction earning me a snowball upside my head from Ella. Looking back on it, Grandpa had known what was coming, and even then he started getting ready for it. We went to bed that night with visions of snowball fights and sledding dancing in our heads, but we woke up to a blizzard outside. My dad and uncle went to stare at it on the porch, drinking coffee as they discussed what to do. Dad had laid by food, but he was worried that he didn't have enough for the 9 people long term. My uncle joked that we could always eat Grandpa, but Dad said that it'd be like chewing on a boiled owl, and they both just laughed. Grandpa, on the other hand, was whittling something from the stove wood. He had been working on it through the night, and it kind of looked like a crossroads sign. It was thick enough in the middle, however, which made me think that there might be more to it. I was too excited for another day of snow, however, to pay Grandpa much heed. Not when there were winter festivities to get up to. My cousins and I played in the blizzard that day, but our games were muted some as the wind picked up and the snow began to fly. The wind was blowing too hard for our snowballs to fly straight. We tried sledding, but the snow was coming down too hard for us to see, and the ice that was forming was starting to hurt our ears and faces. By lunchtime, we were forced to come in out of the cold. Our coats and mittens and hats were soaked through, and after hanging them on pegs in the mudroom, we went into the attic loft, where we were all sleeping to warm up. We had all been set up in sleeping bags up there, my aunt and uncle taking the room I shared with my brother, and it was like having a little camp out. The heat from the fire in the living room made it very warm up there, and as Jasper and I watched from the upper window, he leaned close to the glass and pointed into the woods. "You see that?" he asked. I squinted into the sea of white, trying to find it and finally picking out a single silhouette. It looked like an animal, something on all fours, but it was gone as the wind blew up again, and we were both left looking at the snowy forest. He asked if I'd seen it, probably trying to figure out if he'd been seeing things, and I assured him that I had seen it too. We both sat by the window after the adults had gone to bed, looking out and hoping to catch a glimpse of something in the blowing snow. We didn't see anything, at least I didn't, but we both assured the other that we could see all sorts of spooky things out there. The next day, the blizzard was even worse. December 22nd was too stormy for any of us to even think about going out to play, and when my uncle and father came out bundled to the eyes in several winter coats and the old deerskin breeches they sometimes wore for winter work, I knew they intended to go out anyway. Mom told them they were crazy, but Dad said they needed supplies. The town was only about 2 miles north through the woods, and they could get the essentials and head back before lunch. He kissed Mom and told me to hold down the fort while he was gone. I should be back soon. It's only a couple of miles. They set out about 7, just after breakfast, and I didn't envy them. With the blizzard raging, we mostly sat around the house and watched TV. The set only got 10 channels on a good day, and today we were lucky to get 2. The local weather station came through, on and off, and as the little kids watched public access, I sat and read on the saggy old couch. My cousin had decided to read a magazine he'd brought, and the only breakup over the muffled sound of the TV was Grandpa as he carved his little figure. The skiff, skiff, skiff of Grandpa's whittling knife kept leading me away from the adventures of Frodo and Sam, and I found myself looking at him as he worked. If he was self-conscious about it, he never showed it. Grandpa wasn't so old that he seemed ancient, but even as a kid, he seemed like some wise old elf to a sprat like me. After a while, I finally asked him what he was making, and his answer made me put my book down entirely. A totem? Like a tribal thing? Like in Robinson Crusoe? He smiled wetly at me. Kind of. This one is to keep something specific away, though. Something we may get a look at if we're unlucky. What's that? My cousin asked, and I realized he'd been listening too. The magazine lay across his lap now, and as Grandpa set his knife aside, he lay it on the arm of the chair and moved over to sit closer. Grandpa had just opened his mouth to speak when the lights suddenly went out, and the living room was left in semi-darkness. The power had struggled on manfully, but it had finally given up the ghost. The fire in the grate cast Grandpa in a ghostly pall, and I imagined that this was how his own grandfather had looked when he told stories, once upon a time. When I was younger than you two, but right about Mac's age there, he said, pointing to my brother, there was a blizzard much like this one. It blew in right about Christmas, and it stayed for 5 or 6 days. My brother and I thought it was great, and we played in the snow as the adults looked on with concern. Did we have enough firewood? Did we have enough food? None of that mattered to us, though. Those were matters for adults, and we threw snowballs and built forts and played until the sun set each day. The fire crackled as the little kids moved closer to Grandpa, and we settled in for a story. As the blizzard went on, we noticed that something was stalking the woods around the cabin. It came on all fours like a deer or a stag, but sometimes, if you were quick, you could see it on 2 legs as well. It never got close, not in the beginning, but as the blizzard went on, it crept closer and closer to the house. At night, my brother and I would sit in the attic window, and sometimes its eyes were red as coals in the dark. We were all gathered around him then, listening to the tale, enveloped in the mystery of the creature. Me and Jasper especially, since I was pretty sure that we had seen it yesterday. Every day, it got a little closer, and every day the storm got a little worse. My own grandpa, a man who had seen the beginning of a new century, sat in a chair by the fire, and whittled from the first day of the storm to the last. His old knife, this knife, actually, he said as he held up a fixed-blade knife with a silver handle, was very sharp, and the wood had fallen in thick curls as he worked. I was enthralled by the little carving he was making. I asked him what it was as more of it came out, and he told me it was a ward against something that might come with the storm. I watched him, studied him, and at night we watched the red eyes of the deer thing get closer and closer to the house. By the second night, the eyes might as well be right on the porch, and we were shuddering in our blankets as we wondered what it was. The storm outside made a perfect backdrop for the story, and we were so captured by the tale that we didn't even hear my mother stepping in from the kitchen. On the last day, as the blizzard raged, we heard hoofbeats on the porch. My father wanted to go out and see what it was, but Grandpa said he'd fix it. He told us to go into the attic, told my father and mother to go to their room, and took the thing he had carved out to the porch. There, as we tried to see through the window, we saw a bright light, and the deer fell back into the snow. The deer, however, was wrong. Its legs were too long, its arms ended in strange fingers, and its eyes were— "Pop!" Mom yelled, making all of us jump. "I know you're not trying to keep those kids up all night with such tales." Grandpa had jumped a little too, so enthralled by his own story. He looked sheepish, like he'd been caught doing something wrong, and shrugged as he gave another gummy smile. We all looked at her incredulously, as if not sure what to make of her, but if it made her self-conscious, she didn't budge. "Just a little Christmas story, Peg. I didn't mean any harm." My mother gave him a hard look. "Well, if these boys are awake all night, shivering at the ghosts of some story, then you can sit up with them." She returned to the kitchen then, the smells of lunch wafting from the wood stove that she had in there. "What was it?" I asked Grandpa, keeping my voice low so my mom wouldn't hear, but he shook his head as he returned to his whittling. "Better not to say, boy. Don't want your mother to tell your dad, and then I'll get thrown out in the snow like the leftovers," he said with a wink. He tried to play it off as a joke, but I knew that Grandpa was always very aware that he was a guest in my parents' house. He lived with us for most of my young life, seeing me graduate high school before dying in his sleep one spring, but Mom told me once that it was a blessing to him to be so close to her and Dad and his grandkids. Her other siblings had moved away when they grew up, and Grandpa couldn't imagine himself living anywhere but in the woods that he loved so much. As night fell and my dad and uncle still hadn't returned, Mom started getting worried. The town wasn't that far away, and they should have been back by now. She figured they had just gotten turned around, and maybe they'd come stumbling in after dark. But as the dinner dishes were cleaned away and we all prepared for bed, my mom and aunt became less sure. As we watched through the window, seeing the red eyes that Grandpa had told us about, I heard them making plans to go look for him the next day. "What do you reckon it is?" Jasper said, the two of us watching the eyes as they moved fitfully through the trees that surrounded our cabin. "Dunno. I've never seen anything like that," I admitted. As my mom and aunt turned in and the light that filtered through the boards went out, we settled in as well, still not sure what tomorrow would bring. December 23rd dawned cold, with still no sign of my dad or uncle. Mom was frantic, flitting about the kitchen like a hummingbird, and when she called us to the kitchen around noon, we all expected what was coming. She was dressed warmly, her two thickest coats thrown over a pair of snow pants, and the boots that she had on were Dad's with several pairs of socks inside. "I'm going into town to see about your father. Until I get back, your aunt's in charge. You boys listen to her, okay? Keep an eye on your grandpa. He may need help, and if I'm not here to help with him, then that falls to you two. Be good, And be safe. If the phones come back on, call the sheriff and tell him that your father never came home. If I haven't made it to town, then someone will need to go out and look for us." She left around 11, lunch already on the table, and I watched her go from the front door as she disappeared into the snow. I hoped I would see her again, but after watching my dad and uncle disappear out there too, I wasn't sure I would. As I watched, I could also see the shadow of the creature as it stalked our little house. It was still on all fours, its antlers sometimes knocking snow from the trees, but sometimes, when the wind would blow up, I could see it rise onto its back legs for the briefest moment before it was lost from sight. Mom didn't come back for dinner, and as we went to bed, I could hear my aunt crying in the room that she had shared with my uncle. We all woke up on the 24th, Christmas Eve, feeling hopeless and unsure of what to do. With every passing day, this felt less like a fun time and more like a real problem. My cousins and I started to feel like a bunch of westbound settlers who were watching the hills for Indians. My aunt didn't get up to make us breakfast, and Ella said that she had fallen asleep in my brother's bed with an empty bottle by her head. It was probably the corn whiskey that Dad kept for emergencies, and I suppose that this counted as one of those. We ate cold food from the fridge, Jasper making some eggs to go with it, and the two of us sat and watched the shadowy creature from the porch as we ate. My brother and Ella had gone back to the attic, feeling like they might go back to sleep, which is why they weren't there for what happened next. As we sat munching on cold ham and burnt eggs, the creature stalked the house from the depths of the rising storm. The blizzard was focused, a swirling vortex that seemed to enclose us in a swirl of winter. We were powerless to do anything about it, so we just sat there and watched as it raged and frothed. The creature was barely visible, an outline more often than not, and it seemed odd now that we weren't more worried about it. Both of us had hunted deer, however, and the thought of being scared by a half-starved buck seemed silly. When it turned its horned head towards us, its eyes boring into our conversation as it stepped slowly towards the house, the idea no longer seemed so silly. "What the hell is that?" my cousin said, rising so quickly that his stool went spilling over. "What is that thing?" It had come out of the storm, and we could see that it was a solid white buck, its skin hanging on it like a carcass. Carcass was an apt word, too. The deer looked like a corpse, like some half-eaten piece of roadkill that had gotten up to seek revenge. Its antlers were huge, the tines many and majestic. It was a 13 or 14-point buck by a quick count, but as I watched, the sharp bones seemed to move with an eerie independence from their host. They squirmed like a nest of snakes, and the creature reminded me of Medusa as it stood glowering at us. Its blazing eyes still glowed like coals, and it was baring its flat teeth at us like it meant to bite. I wished, suddenly, that I had my rifle, but it was in the room with my aunt, and absolutely of no use to me here. I don't think either of us were truly afraid until the creature stood up on its hind legs, legs that now seemed as boneless as the Gumby character that my little brother liked to watch, and it began to run at us. We barely made it into the house, slamming the door behind us when it hit the wood hard enough to shake it in the frame. Jasper and I went deeper into the house, but as I came to the ladder that led to the attic, I remembered Grandpa was still in the living room. Mom's words echoed in my head, and I told him to go on and make sure the others were okay. He nodded, understanding, and when I got to the living room, I found Grandpa still working on his totem. "Grandpa, we've got to go," I told him, trying to get him up. This thing, it's going to get us if we don't." "I'm almost done, kiddo. Once I'm done, we'll be safe." I heard the door beginning to splinter, but Grandpa just shrugged me off as I tried to help him up. "Grandpa, we need to get to the attic. I've seen this thing, and I can tell you that your carving isn't going to..." But I never finished. The door burst open then, and the cadaverous deer creature came snorting into the living room. I was frozen in fear as it strode in, its hooves clicking on the floor, and I saw its front legs end in the same snaky appendages that had decorated its head. They were like fingers in some nightmare picture, and its red eyes focused on us as it came striding into the living room. His horns made a hellish noise as they scraped the ceiling, sending curls of wood down in a shower. He was focused on Grandpa, his eyes boring into him, but as I started to bolt, he swept up a hand and held me back. I looked down and found that to my surprise, the old man was smiling. "Fancy meeting you again after all this time," Grandpa said, the deer snarling and snorting a mere 15 feet away. He started moving after a few tense seconds, but when Grandpa lifted his hand, I was momentarily blinded by a white-hot light that emanated from the carving there. I saw the face carved there for half a bitter second, the huge eyes and roaring mouth looking formidable, and then I had to throw my hands over my eyes as my senses were assaulted by a sudden cry of primal rage. It was as if the totem was bellowing at the interloper, screaming down the deer thing that meant to kill me and Grandpa, and all my senses seemed assaulted at once. I was blind, deaf, smellless, unspeaking, and incapable of thought. I was as Adam must have been for the first few moments of his creation, and when I was able to gain my senses, I found myself lying on the floor as Grandpa looked on placidly. Of the deer, there was no sign, and Grandpa's totem looked as if it had been through the heart of a blazing inferno. The features were still perfect, only charred to a dumb muteness by the effort of expelling the deer thing. It had taken everything the little effigy had to set the creature aside, and now it was used up. Grandpa handed it to me, the carving leaving char stains on my fingers as it passed between us. "Here, you might need to know how to carve one yourself someday." I started to thank him, but that was when I heard my father's angry yell as he asked just what the hell had happened to the door. Some of his anger was set aside when I came running up to hug him, and I could see both my uncle and my mother standing slightly behind him as they looked concerned and confused. I tried my best to explain what had happened, but I don't think they believed me. Dad was skeptical that all this had happened in the few hours that he'd been gone, but Mom pointed out that he'd been gone for at least a day and a half. That really threw him, and when he told her that he had just left that morning, she said that he'd been in the woods since the 21st. "Yeah," he agreed, "this morning." The two went back and forth, but when I told Mom that she had been in the woods overnight as well, she also looked confused. Both of them had been in the woods overnight. Dad had actually been in the woods for 2 nights, but both parties said that the sun had never gone down. They had been roaming through the woods looking for the town and had just appeared back here all of a sudden. When Dad had found Mom in the woods, he assumed that she had come out looking for him. They had all 3 returned home, a trip that had taken less than a few minutes, and figured they had just gotten turned around in the blizzard. Speaking of the blizzard, it had stopped as suddenly as it had started. The power came back on a little while later, and when my aunt woke up to find her husband had returned, we all took stock of the fridge and began working on one of the best Christmas dinners ever. That particular Christmas was one that I'll always remember, and not just because of the deer thing. We had many more Christmases like that in the years to come, but none quite so tumultuous as that one. I still live in that house, both my parents long dead, but every year we all get together and have Christmas like we used to. We tell our kids and grandkids about the Christmas we were all snowed in, and I've been practicing my whittling since the day Grandpa set the deer thing aside in a blaze of light. I haven't seen one since, but who knows who might come to visit one snowy Christmas in Appalachia. you're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad and Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Saikat, Lee Kendall, Janet, and Chris Kinsella for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. And, of course, thanks to Xaronan, Winter, Tyler Parker, Stephanie Carrington, Sarah ASMR, Hi Stacy, Emily Coltsfoot, and Cinnamon Fox, and Bella Lee for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. As I said, if you'd like to have your name read out at the end of every episode that I make, and maybe get a little more, come on down to Patreon and sign up, or become a member on YouTube. Ghostly Reader tier contributors get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. So, what are you waiting for? Come on down and give it a look. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.